All right, Sixers fans, welcome to a new edition of our live stream. Before we jump into things, don't forget, subscribe to Liberty Ballers Podcast Network. You can catch us wherever you get your fix, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, you name it, we are there. And of course, check us out at libertyballers.com. Joining me, as they usually do for the live stream, Mr. Paul Hudrick, Jackson Frank. Fellas, let's jump right into it. Game one. The Sixers look really good for, I don't want to say really good, but they look good for maybe like 27 minutes of that game. They led 61-60 in the third quarter, and then it was all Miami from that point on. Major struggles on the offensive end, major struggles on the offensive rebounding. They gave up 15 to the Heat. And this one, Paul, we'll start with you. Looking at that game yesterday, what do you think ultimately went wrong in the second half for the Sixers, given the fact that they were right there throughout, like I said, a majority of the first half and early into the third quarter?
I thought that James Harden and Tyrese Maxey both were actually really good, especially in the second quarter, generating offense, getting into the paint, getting some good looks. And then in the second half, that changed, partly because of the Heat. I thought the Heat just really upped their intensity. They really, really made a more concerted effort to really clog the paint. And the fact that the Sixers shooters weren't hitting, it just made clogging the paint for the Heat easier because they felt no pain from doing so. And then on top of that, you know, when you have a center in DeAndre Jordan that's really giving you, I mean, nothing on the offensive end of the floor, it's basically like they're playing 5-on-4 on that end. So, yeah, I mean, offensively, like you said, that was where I thought the biggest issue was. I thought defensively they actually held up okay. Tobias Harris continues to be like a revelation in the playoffs so far. He's been really, really good. Obviously his best offensive game of the series. And I will say that I do, if I'm going to take like a bright spot from this game, obviously Tobias, but I'd say too, if you do eventually, and I'm sure we're going to get into it, if you do eventually get Joel Embiid back into the fold, seeing that Tobias Harris could potentially be a matchup problem for the Heat, I feel like that's a really good sign for the Sixers because that's, you know, another really good option that the Heat are going to have to keep in check. Now, we got a long ways to go probably till we get there. Still got to play at least one game in Miami before we get to that point. But just, I thought the encouraging thing is I thought there were moments and signs that that the Sixers, one, were able to find some holes in the Heat's defense, and two, that they were able to kind of blow up. And Jackson, you talked about it a lot, those DHO plays. The Sixers blew a lot of those up early on. But then the second half, and some of the lineup decisions, obviously, you know, with Doc Rivers, we can get into all that. But having Matisse Thybulle, DeAndre Jordan, and Furkan Korkmaz all on the floor, I understand it's like there are no good answers for Doc Rivers right now, but like that lineup was especially pretty bad. And I think that stretch for Miami speaks for itself. That, again, not to take anything away from the Heat, who are a fantastic team and did a lot of things well in the second half and clearly upped their physicality and adjusted. But I agree with what you said off the top, Jazz. Just offensively, that's where their biggest issue was. And I think until they can get more out of the 5 position, I think those struggles are going to continue.
Jackson, yeah, you mentioned that yesterday on Twitter as well. The Sixers are doing a pretty good job on the defensive end in terms of not allowing Miami to get into its sets, not allowing the Heat to really, you know, control things on the offensive end. And I think overall, like you mentioned there, Paul, they did a pretty damn good job overall on the defensive end. But looking at this now, 6 of 34 from beyond the arc, obviously not going to cut it when you're missing your MVP guy. Specifically on the offensive end, Jackson, we saw a lot of just stretches that the Sixers couldn't do anything. They weren't able to get a foot in the paint, a lot of standing around iso ball early on in the possession. The next thing you know, they're trying to get something going with 13, 14 seconds left on the shot clock. But I noticed this before, and we've all talked about it, not only in live streams, but also on podcasts, is they're just unable to get any weak side movement. And there were plenty of possessions yesterday, especially in that second half, where you had Tobias Harris or Tyrese Maxey or James Harden dribble at the top of the key, unable to really get any penetration, not beating their defender, which resulted in one pass and a quick contested three-pointer. Looking at this now, since we know Joel is not going to get back in the lineup for at least game 2, what else can the Sixers do on the offensive end to make sure they don't go through a stretch like that where they just get completely killed by Miami? And as you mentioned, Paul, the Heat weren't that great on the offensive end, but because the Sixers were struggling so much, that gap just kept getting bigger and bigger as we got towards the end of the third quarter.
Yeah, and I think it should be noted, at least what I noticed, throughout the game. I'm going to go back and watch some of those offensive possessions, but I feel like in the first half, the Heat were running a lot of full court pressure, and the Sixers were getting into space off of that because they were beating it. In the second half, they kind of changed it to like a half court press, which really extended the Sixers' offense in the half court and made it tough for them to kind of find that same level of space. But where they did have success, I think, is kind of replicable. If you saw the Sixers initiate some stuff from the side rather than up top, James Harden hit a pull-up three. Maxey had a nice little like runner or leaner through contact in the first half, and they went away from that in the second half. Miami, like I said, went to half court pressure, really loaded those driving lanes up to deter Harden from getting downhill, Maxey from getting downhill. You saw Harden only take 4 shots in the second half compared to 9 in the first half. I think that was a big difference as well. So trying to kind of use Miami's aggression against it, so initiate more stuff from one side, swing it to the other. That the Sixers run kind of those those weak side kind of flare screens, ball screens for Maxey to get downhill. See if you can do it with Tobias or even Harden at times. Whether it's Harden's not going to be some guy who's going to blow you away off the dribble, but just kind of something to tilt the defense, because as I said, that Miami's going to keep stuff loaded at the elbows and the free throw line extended, stuff like that. So it felt like they ran a lot of stuff up from the top of the key, and that's where Miami wants to play, because they're going to keep you out of the middle. And if you have to kind of go to another side, you're in a tough spot. So that would be the kind of the biggest adjustment. And like I said, we saw some of the Sixers use that to their advantage a little bit, but that really dried up in the second half. Harden rushed a couple of threes. Maxey rushed a lot of his threes, I thought, which was uncharacteristic for him in both halves. Was only 1 of 6, and his 1 3 was kind of a kick out, I think, after a Paul Reed offensive rebound when the game was not officially out of contention, but more or less. So that's what I would try and do, is just use their aggression against him. Just swing the ball, play from side to side and then get downhill rather than just up top and look for something in the paint, because that was working. And people will point to the Sixers shooting poorly from 3, and they will shoot better, but the Heat weren't great either, and the Heat led the NBA in 3-point percentage this year. So that's not something you can just say, oh yeah, we'll shoot better and then things will be all right. I mean, Max Strus 1 of 7 from 3, and he got a lot of good looks. So I think it's got to be more than that. And it's got to come from kind of a little more ball movement, getting downhill with that ball movement rather than side to side. You can use the side to side, but don't have that be how the possession ends. Have it be a part of the possession.
Paul, you're obviously around the team a ton, basically cover every home game, at every practice, at the media. They have media availability. Looking at this right now from Doc's perspective, and we've seen him get a little bit testy now a couple of times over the last week or so, especially when he was talking about the 3-1 deficits and being able to allow teams to come back. He referenced, look at that roster with the Magic, and he was talking about when the Pistons won in 2004 last week, and then even now with DeAndre Jordan. Like, following that game yesterday, he was asked about it, and he's like, well, we're going to go with DJ. That's what I don't care what you think. Well, again, Doc, I don't know if you look at the analytics, but DeAndre Jordan in the playoffs, I know it's a small sample size, minus 66.7 net rating. Okay. And yeah, you talk about the offense, the Heat, the Sixers, part of me, averaging 87.9 points per 100 possessions with him on the court. When you look at Doc's fixation, and Doc's, let's be honest, it's stubbornness in dealing with this. Why is he so tethered to DeAndre Jordan when we see Paul Reed? Again, Paul Reed, not great, still developing on his own, but he does some things out there. He grabs offensive rebounds. He's attacks when he can, still, a little bit of foul happy, gets himself into some issues in terms of reaching in, not moving his feet enough, which are things you expect from a young guy who wasn't too heralded coming into the league. But I think we all see the difference. Anybody who watches basketball or knows anything about basketball sees the difference. Why is Doc so stuck on having DeAndre Jordan not only in the starting lineup, but playing as much as he is, when we've seen the proof be in the pudding?
Well, Jas, it's a small sample size. I mean, you can't.
I meant in the playoffs. I meant in the playoffs.
Net rating number. It's such a small sample.
Well, I mean, isn't that one game basically the entirety of his? I mean,
yeah,
the playoff sample besides the one possession at the end of game 3.
Other than garbage time, yeah. And it stinks because I feel like DeAndre Jordan is getting piled on right now, and he seems like a great guy. He's been really good here as far as like being a good teammate. Like, you could tell he coaches guys up. Like, he's really enthusiastic. Like, when he was asked about like playing the other day, he said, I just want to win a championship. And that was it. Like, are you preparing for, I think it was something like, are you preparing for a bigger role? He's like, I'm preparing to try to win a championship. So like, he just, I feel so bad like ripping the guy because he had such a great career. He was such a good player for so long. And it's like sad to see that he's just not even close to that guy anymore. He just really can't do the things the Sixers need him to do. He can't move like he used to, and it's really hampering him. And for Doc Rivers to just continually keep playing him, and I just don't see it. I don't see what Doc Rivers is seeing. He mentioned that DeAndre, that they went on a run to start the second half at the beginning of the third quarter. I don't know what you could point to in that stretch and say, yes, DeAndre Jordan contributed to that run. I don't think that's what it was. I think it was, they got a couple stops, they got a couple of transition baskets, and they built the lead a little bit.
I think they ended up being outscored during DeAndre's, like they had a nice little 4-0 run, and DeAndre had a lob ball. It was a nice play by him and James, but like I think they were up 51-50 going into the third quarter, and then DeAndre subbed out and they're down 62-61. So like it doesn't make sense. Like
no,
you can't use a run for part of his minutes. That's not how a run works.
Right. And then the other thing too, I mean, he talked about like, rebounding. DeAndre Jordan played 17 minutes and got 2 rebounds. Yeah. Respect, and I understand, like, in some, like, I don't know why people are really stumping for DeAndre Jordan. Maybe it's because he is, again, such a good dude, and because he has had such a good career that maybe some people feel like he's just getting too much grief here. But sure, like maybe he kept Bam off the glass for like a possession or two, but for the most part, if you watched him play, he really did not help them on the glass. Again, 2 rebounds in 17 minutes. And there was just little, like he caught 2 lobs, like that was it. And like you said, like the one was an unbelievable play by James Harden. That pass was unreal. And then the other one in the first half was off the full court pressure, where Tobias Harris just got a free lane to drive all the way down the floor, and then it was an easy lob. I just, and again, this goes back to what we talked about already, where there are no good options here. You're missing Joel Embiid, who is an MVP finalist and arguably the most dominant big man in the entire, maybe arguably the most dominant player in the NBA. You're missing him, and your options just aren't that great. You have 2 guys who are, quite frankly, past their prime, in DeAndre Jordan and Paul Millsap, and then you have 2 guys that kind of aren't quite even at their primes yet, who are just really breaking into the league. You have nobody in that middle ground that you can, 1, trust, but then 2, can still play and still bring something to the table. So Paul Reed is an imperfect option. He's the best option. I understand he gets in foul trouble. That's going to happen, but I think you have to play him as much as you possibly can. If he fouls out, he fouls out. Like, you just got to let it happen. If that's going to happen, you can't say, I'm not playing him because I'm afraid he's going to commit fouls. Let him play and commit those fouls, and then you can go from there. And then I thought too, like, Paul Millsap only played 5 minutes. I thought he was more effective in those 5 minutes than DeAndre Jordan was his entire 17. He can move. I mean, it's, again, not a perfect option, not even a good option, but he's like, of the 4 backup centers, I hate to say it, but like, I think DeAndre Jordan is the 4th best option. I would say it's Reed, and then Millsap and Bassey, I'd say, are close, and then it's DeAndre Jordan. And I only say that with Bassey because, 1, he didn't get the opportunity to play down the stretch with the Sixers. He played a lot with the Blue Coats. And then 2, he's coming off a shoulder injury. So it is not a great position for him to come in and have to play NBA playoff minutes as a rookie and all that. So that's where maybe I give Millsap the slight edge, but it's not much of one. And to me, it goes back to, and Bodner asked the question during the regular season, and it triggered Doc, but it's a fair question. Shouldn't he, instead of giving DeAndre Jordan all of that run at the end of the regular season, when you know what DeAndre Jordan is, you've had DeAndre Jordan before. He's had a long career. We all know what DeAndre Jordan is, what he brings to the table. Why would you keep playing him all these backup center minutes, not give Paul Reed another look, not give Bassey another look, just to see it? And just to prepare him so that when Paul Reed gets into this moment, perhaps he is a little bit more disciplined because he got more run at the end of the season. Or maybe Bassey, if he's getting pro minutes instead of G League minutes, maybe he shows you something that shows, okay, maybe we can trust him in this matchup or that matchup or whatever. And then on top of that, what I thought was odd, they go on, I believe it was a 10-2 run to end the second quarter to close the half to take the lead. They did that with a small ball lineup. They did that with Tobias Harris and George Niang basically being their 4 and 5. It seemed to give the Heat a lot of issues. It seemed to throw them off. They were kind of switching everything, and the Heat didn't seem super comfortable going up against that. We didn't see it again for the rest of the game. I believe Doc said something like, well, we haven't practiced it enough. It worked. Go back to it. Like this is a guy who said before the playoff season, before the series started, without Joel Embiid, I have to be creative. We have to take risks. We have to do different things. You did a different thing. It worked. And then you never went back to it. So it's just befuddling that he just didn't
practice. Like, are you telling me that they run a bunch of like starters plus DeAndre Jordan minute like in practice? Like,
how much time did you really have over the
right
3 days so that this?
I mean, I assume that's probably all they did for the 2 days, but still, like that's
not much either, right?
No, right. And then before that, like when we talked to Doc during practice, he said Paul Reed was terrific in the Toronto series, and then said B, that he looked his best playing with the starters. So then you start DeAndre Jordan. So it's like and then on top of that, and I'll end this on here because I know I'm going on a rant here, but like Doc Rivers, again, in that response to Bodner, said, I'll say it slowly. I'm playing small. Paul Reed plays the small bigs. DeAndre Jordan plays the big bigs. Bam Adebayo is not any bigger than anyone on the Toronto Raptors. And he started DeAndre Jordan. I don't get it. And then Dwayne Dedmon is the backup.
Yeah.
Makes no sense.
I just wish Doc would say that I've coached DeAndre for many years before. There's a familiarity aspect that I like to rely on in the playoffs. And we could disagree with it, but it would at least make sense in these things that don't hold up when you examine. Like, just tell us. Like, coaches like familiarity. It's fine. Like, I would criticize the move to play him, but I would at least understand your rationale rather than these reasons you give us that aren't aligning with what we're seeing and what is actually reflective of reality.
And then to say whether you like it or not, like, first of all, you're talking to media. They don't care. Like, they don't care whether you win or lose or who you play. They're just simply asking, hey, this doesn't look very good when you do it. So why are you doing it? Like, it blows my mind.
Well, and that's the thing. You look at Paul Reed. He had 9 rebounds in that game, as I mentioned, 5 on the offensive end. Also had 4 assists too. So he's giving you something that you desperately need. Of course, the fouls are an issue on the defensive end, but at the same time, offensively, you're not just playing 4-on-5 like you out there. Like, if you put Matisse and DeAndre Jordan out there, you're severely hampered, and anybody can see that. I don't know why he can't. Although, Paul, I will say one thing. When you got into your rant there about DeAndre Jordan, he's a nice guy. He's had a long career, but doesn't have it anymore. Kind of reminded me on the podcast front. So thank you. Reminded me about myself. So thank you for saying that. But
you got plenty in the tank.
Jackson, when we're looking at this now going forward, okay, we know Kyle Lowry not in the lineup for the Heat for game 2. Don't know when he's going to be back yet. But going into that right now, sure, that's not going to kill the Heat. We saw they're still pretty damn good without Kyle Lowry, even though, again, Lowry is a former All-Star. Obviously has a championship pedigree, winning the title with the Raptors in 2019. But looking at this from your perspective now, game 2, how important is it? Because I'm looking at this, if you can steal one in Miami, we said this before the series, if you could just steal one where everything goes right, where Tyrese Maxey has 30, James Harden has 25, Tobias Harris, who, as we mentioned, has been great throughout the entire playoffs, playing at a very high level for himself, still not worthy of that contract. That's a topic for another day, but doing his job overall. How important is it that you think the Sixers get this game, and what do you think they need to do to basically throw the kitchen sink at Miami and walk out of there with a win?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's some of the things that Paul touched on, and when he just spoke. I mean, going small more often. You just like you trust you let Paul Reed play until he exhausts all 6 fouls he can use. And Paul, I don't think he was great last night. Like he made some mistakes and he missed quite a few shots around the rim and whatnot. But like at least he's getting offensive rebounds, some missed shots, right? That's there's something there. So Harden has to be more aggressive in the second half. We can tell. I think the way I try to frame it is some of the decisions Doc is doing is really hampering this team. They're not the only reasons, but this team already has a small margin of error when it's without Joel Embiid. So Harden has to be better. I think they, and I try not to lean on this with my analysis, but I think they did look tired in that second half defensively. They played so hard in that first half it's hard to chase around Max Strus and Gabe Vincent and Jimmy Butler and close off passing lanes. And I thought Niang looked tired in the second half. I thought Harden looked tired. I thought Danny looked tired as well. And I think it was different for sometimes Danny just doesn't look like he's had it athletically at times this year. I thought he looked fatigued at times yesterday, which is different to me than how he's played. So I don't, it was fun. Like yesterday on the TNT broadcast, they were like, I think they got to go deeper into their bench. And it was like, do we watch the same? Like they played 11 guys before garbage time yesterday. I don't know what we're talking about there. So there's not really a great option.
The Heat can go deep into their bench. They didn't even play Duncan Robinson. Like they have other guys they can even go to.
Yeah. So I just thought that was
they
tried a bunch of Sixers tried a bunch of guys. I don't know if it's necessarily like they didn't play 7 dudes. It wasn't an issue. It wasn't Nick Nurse in the middle of February or anything like that. So I think, just they're going to have to hit more threes, which sounds simplistic, but George Niang goes 0 of 7. His minutes are pretty detrimental to you when that happens. Maxey, I think they rushed a few shots. I don't know. There's not a lot of great options. It was kind of a weird game where I just felt like it wasn't, I didn't feel like I had a great grasp of it. Like I said, I'll rewatch some of it or whatever before tomorrow. But I think it's just, it just don't. It seems so easy not to play DeAndre Jordan, but if we're trying to look for actual realistic solutions, that's not one of them because clearly that's not going to happen. But go small more. Hit more of a threes. I think like I said, get into that second side offense a little bit more. And just Harden has to be more aggressive too. It wasn't just the passing. There wasn't just the scoring that went quiet in the second half. It was the passing as well. So and that's kind of where you wonder how. And Paul, you wrote, justifiably so that he's been very adaptable in terms of kind of how he handles things, but he's still not the most versatile of offensive player, right? There's kind of, I think he can shift between kind of scorer and passer. Obviously, he has to do more passing now, but you're not going to run him off the ball a ton, right? And so, and he likes to play at the top of the key, and that's where the Heat want to take teams. They want to flare him out to the wings, and so I just kind of wonder what they can do from there. And so it seems simplistic, but they're going to have to hit more threes, but I also think they have to create better looks from three, right? They got some good looks, but it was also kind of a lot of bailout last second shots from George or Danny. And, I think you more want George and Danny taking shots with 12 seconds left on the shot clock when the ball swings their way for an open three rather than a desperation pass that they kind of have to rush. So I hope that all makes sense, but there's not a lot of great options.
No, it does. Doc actually said post-game, he felt like the shots were good, but they weren't great. And he said he felt like there were a bunch of times where the pass should have gotten there a half a tick sooner for it to be an even cleaner look. And, again, not a good look, but a great look. So I think obviously your analysis is spot on there. And Doc Rivers agrees with you. So maybe you know a little ball, unlike people that are actually there, apparently.
Well, fellas, looking at the bench too, we mentioned looking at the offensive end that the Sixers they're going to have to score something about 105, 110, play good defense to beat Miami in game 2. And we mentioned they have to get big games from 2 out of, at least in my opinion, Harden, Maxey, and Tobias Harris. But you look at the bench guys, right? In this game, 52 combined minutes for Thibault, Shake Milton, and George Niang, who are your first 3 guys off the bench. They combined for 6 points overall. And that's not going to cut it, again, without Embiid in the lineup. But looking forward now in this series, we don't obviously know what's going to happen in game 2, Paul. But for Joel Embiid, Doc Rivers had some encouraging comments on Tuesday morning, basically saying, hey, you know what? He's looking pretty good and things are trending in the right direction. Doesn't want to get anybody's hopes up from what and again, being around the team so much. What are the chances that Joel is back for game 3?
I think they're pretty good, mostly because of Joel Embiid, because I think if he is comfortable and he is told by medical professionals that he is clear to play, I'm sure he'll have to wear some form of protective mask. I believe Woj already reported that he's cleared. His concussion symptoms have cleared. He has not had any symptoms. So that's obviously a pretty enormous hurdle to overcome because that's something when you're talking about head injuries and stuff around your eye, those are things that you don't want to mess with. Like playing with, a torn ligament in your thumb isn't great, but that's not going to, potentially cause issues for you for the rest of your life. You wouldn't think, at least not mentally or anything like that, or mess with your sight or anything like that. But I think as long as he's comfortable, as long as the doctors, the athletic trainers and everyone tells him you can do this but you have to wear this mask, I think he will return. Game 3 makes sense. When you look at kind of the timeline of things, I know a lot of people pointed to Capella a few years back, missed, I believe it was 6 days with a orbital bone fracture that did not require surgery. Obviously, everybody's different. The degree is going to be different. Not everybody's the same. But if it's obviously in line with that, then him playing Friday night in Philadelphia would line up. That would make a lot of sense. So, I tend to be, I guess, Doc didn't want to give people hope, and I get that. I think that's a smart move by Doc, as he likes to point out, that is just a nickname. But I feel
we just
optimistic.
refer to him as Glenn from now on. Is that what we should do? But yeah, okay, yeah.
Well, that was my guy Mark Zumoff. That was a funny thing. You weren't here for that, Jas. But when Doc first got hired, because obviously, so throughout Doc's career, Zumoff always called him Glenn because he said there's only one Doc in Philly, which I thought was brilliant. But I do think they came to an agreement. I think Mark, once he became the coach, said, like, all right. And actually, Doc was a good sport about it. He said he was going to just keep calling him Glenn. And Doc's like, yeah, I get it. Freaking Dr. J, man. Like, I get it. And that's where he got the nickname from. But anyway, I feel like he's going, like, just the way he's pushed through everything this year, the way he's really gutted it out all season long. And like, for it, like, basically, I like for him to like not play now, I think, like, I would be surprised because he's just pushed through so much already. He had such a great series against Toronto, came up so huge. Even with the thumb, he was tremendous. And especially if they're down 0-2, he's going to do everything in his power to get back, you would think, for game 3. So without having really any inside knowledge, I feel pretty optimistic that we'll see Joel Embiid in game 3.
And I think he, like, and every player, I'm sure Matt feels this way, but he's been very vocal about like he wants to kind of like shuck the injury prone label or whatever he's had. And I think like he says that he sees all the criticism about him, and that's kind of the last remaining thing. And so, and I'm not saying he's going to like let discourse to decide whether he plays, but I think he takes a lot of like public pride and discernible pride in having played so many games this year. And so I think, if, as you said, Paul, if it's just you have to wear this mask and it might be a little intrusive, he'll be like, all right, like intrusive is better than watching from the sidelines or at home. So I'll take that. Yeah, I tend to agree. Yeah, without any sourced information that he'll play on Friday. Excuse me, not Wednesday.
Yeah, the guy's
Friday,
and he's been Jackson. He's been a soldier all the way throughout. Now he's gonna have a tape on his thumb. He's gonna have a mask on his face. I mean, you can't stop the dude. Just can't stop the dude from playing. But looking at this now in the bigger picture, Jackson, let's just say hypothetically, we don't know for sure yet, obviously, so I'm not saying that. But let's say the Heat do win game 2 and they're up 2-0 going back to Philly. Joel comes back. They don't know what you're going to get from him. I'm pretty sure he's still going to be damn near the level that we've been accustomed to throughout the entire season. But do you still think the Sixers would have much of a chance to beat the Heat 4 out of 5 games with Joel in the lineup, knowing that he's going to have all these ailments?
Yeah, I mean, if you're down 2-0, like it's tough to beat anyone in the NBA, like regardless who it is. It could be the team with the least amount of wins in the NBA. Winning 4 out of 5 times against them is tough. But I watched that game 1, and I know the Heat didn't shoot well either. But like, I didn't think they were in a different class than the Sixers. And of course, there's a caveat that Kyle Lowry was very important at organizing their half court offense and kind of making some of those connective plays as a screener, passer, whatever it is, long range shooter wasn't available. But like, it's not a hot take to say that Joel's more important to the Sixers than Kyle Lowry is to the Heat. And that's not to diminish Lowry. Again, he's very important to what they do. But like, I wouldn't necessarily pick them to win game 2, but I could see them winning game 2 and we go back to Philly and it's 1-1. And then I think what's so important is, the arrival of Harden allows them to run more pick and roll stuff. We've seen what the Heat can do to Joel on the post at times, with their aggressive doubles and their handiness and whatnot, like similar to Toronto, but they have Bam Adebayo as a primary guy who has finished 4th in DPOI voting this year. So it's a level up there. So that's the nice thing is you can just counter and say, okay, let's just run more pick and roll with Harden. And I think Miami can't switch that, right? Like you can't if like. Yeah, if you're going to throw PJ Tucker on Joel, like, because I imagine you're going to have PJ Tucker on Harden and Bam on Joel, assuming Joel plays whenever it is. Like you can switch that, but like, and obviously Bam is good at clogging passing lanes, but you don't feel comfortable with that as Miami. Like Tucker is as a great center of gravity, super strong, but like Joel's one of the strongest players in the NBA. Like you don't feel comfortable with that, so that's a nice counter you can throw. Is like, yeah, maybe we're not going to run so much post stuff, but we're still going to run our Chicago actions, our dribble handoff, pick and roll, things like that with Joel and James and feel comfortable. So, like, I think, winning a 4 out of 5 is hard, but I don't think, winning game 2 is an impossible task by any means. And, it helps the Sixers have the guys to get hot from 3, right? Like, it's not like they're just some team that has to get downhill constantly to score. Like, again, they have to create better looks from 3, but like, it's not out of the realm of possibility that Danny Green and George Niang combined to go 7 of 12 from 3 in game 2 rather than, what was it, 1 of 13, 2 of 13. And all of a sudden the game is a lot closer. And, you get a couple of bounces your way from a Maxey 3, or Harden's a little more aggressive down the stretch. There you go. But yeah, if it's down 2-0, yeah, it's hard to pick them. But I don't think 2-0 is a foregone conclusion. Not that you're saying that, Jas, but and like we know, it's going to be the exact same guys who played game one for each side. So we know they can play with them through 27 minutes, which again is not 48 minutes is the entire thing, of course. But I'd favor the Heat, and I think the Heat should be projected to win by 8, 12, 10 points. But I don't think that's an insurmountable advantage by any means. I think you could definitely look at this series being 1-1 and going back to Philly, but I wouldn't bet on it by any means.
Yeah, 1-1 would just make it that much easier. Again, with Joel, and we don't know how much he's going to be. If he played pretty well with the mask, a few years ago when he had it, so I'm not going to say that that's going to impede him at all. But you look at the numbers on it: 439 times teams have went down 2-0 in the playoffs. Just 31 have come back from that to win the series. So again, that's why it's imperative. Where I said, you know what, throw the kitchen sink. Even if you got to play your main guys, 40, 41 minutes in this one, get back to game 3, hopefully get that emotional lift from Joel being there, maybe steal that one. But I just think it's imperative that the Sixers at least do everything they can to win game 2. A couple more questions for you guys before we wrap up here. Paul, I wanted to ask you about this. James Harden, Jackson, you mentioned him earlier on, only took 4 shots in the second half. He finished 5 of 13, 16 points, 9 boards, 5 dimes. They need more from this guy. You want a 5-year, $260 million extension in the offseason, you got to show that you're worth it. And I think right now with Harden, we've seen his struggles. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that in terms of his burst, in terms of a step back in his athletic ability, just not seeing him be the same finisher that he was during his heyday in Houston. But looking at this game 2 performance, Paul, how important do you think it is that he gets going? And at least, again, it doesn't have to, but in my opinion, the Sixers need him to score 25 or 30 if they want to steal a game against the Heat in the second one coming up on Wednesday.
Absolutely. It's critical that he is, and I don't look at it necessarily about points, that he's got to score X amount of points. I more look at it as he needs to control the game. Like he needs to be, because I thought like Toronto game 6, I thought that's what was so good in the first is that he scored, but more so he controlled the game. In game 1, he was like that too. Like I thought he was borderline brilliant in games 1 and 6 in that Toronto series, where it's just everything, like he made everything happen, and it just made everyone else's job easier, from Joel to Tyrese to Tobias, everyone on down. Just it opened everything up for everyone. And so I think that's more important than necessarily, hitting 25, 30 points. Of course, that would help. They could use it. But if like Maxey and Tobias Harris both score 30 points and James Harden scores 18 and has like 15 assists, you're perfectly okay with that, especially if you walk out of Miami with a win. So, and I think, not to make excuses for James, because I agree, Jas, like there have been moments where you just really wonder, like, okay, is it the hamstring? Has he just flat out lost a step? Like, is it just all of that mileage just really catching up to him at, almost 33 years old? What is it? Or does he have to change his play style a little bit? Like, what is it that's causing him to not be so effective? But I will say in the second half, again, and Tyrese Maxey struggled as well in the second half. And I think it was because, and you saw, like, I don't think it's a coincidence those two struggled and Tobias Harris kept playing well, because it was very clear Miami's strategy was take away Harden, take away Maxey. We'll live with what Tobias Harris does. Not to take anything away from Tobias, because he was great. He made Miami sweat by that strategy, because they were basically saying, we'll let Tobias beat us. And he did for the bulk of the game. So, in that sense, it kind of didn't work. But at the same time, it worked in stifling Harden and Maxey. And we've touched on it a million times. But when they're not hitting shots, you're not making Miami pay for that strategy. You're not making Miami pay for closing off the middle of the floor. So you got like George Yang can't go 0 for 7. Danny Green can't go 1 for 6. Shake Milton has to hit, his open opportunities. Like they have to hit and again, Maxey has to hit his open ones. I agree with you, Jackson, that I thought he rushed a couple of them, took a couple kind of 30 footers that, he can hit those from time to time, but I didn't think they were necessarily, I wouldn't say quite ill-advised, but maybe not the shot you would want in certain situations.
Those are kind of game-breaking ones, right? Where he's had a transition bucket, and then hits a pull-up 3 in the flow of things, and then they get a stop, and he comes down, and they're up 8 all of a sudden after he hits that 3. These ones felt like they're trying to he was trying to stop a run with them or go on a run. It's like
right. That's exactly. There was one in particular in the third quarter where the offense had really, really got clogged up, and the Heat were on a run, and they got a transition opportunity, and he pulled up from 3, and I think Doc even like yelled at him, like, listen, and it's kind of like, that it's the cliche saying, but you can get that shot anytime you want it, kind of a thing. Like, run the offense or get to the paint, because you need a good shot. You don't need that shot. So I do. And I think that's, and we've touched on this before, like, this is where Tyrese Maxey is kind of like, where he'll go from being like very good to perhaps that next step of being like a star. I mean, those are the kind of little nuances that he needs to figure out in order to get to that next level. And the guy's in his second year. He's 21 years old. Like, he's got a lot of time to figure that out. It's just unfortunate that it's coming in kind of this pressure situation where they need him to do that, because without Joel Embiid, whereas when he's like the third or fourth option, it's easy for him to kind of ease into that. So, but sure, I think, again, it's not necessarily scoring with James Harden as much as it's about him taking the game over, and just being the guy who, eats up all the focus, but still manages to make the right play every time, and sets guys up and then drives and finishes when it's open.
And Jackson, I want to wrap up on this, looking at, and Paul, you're talking about Maxey. Look back at that game, March 21st, where he had 28 points. They were without Embiid. They were without Harden. They beat a very good Heat squad at that time to kind of keep themselves in the running for the top spot in the Eastern Conference. But you look back at that game, the Sixers did a great job of isolating Tyler Hero on the defensive end and attacking him and allowing Maxey to get out, at least in the open court, and get some easy buckets in transition. When you look at that, Jackson, what are you looking for from Philly tomorrow in terms of getting Maxey back into that position? And what does he need to do individually to make sure that, again, might not score 28 points again, but I mean, at least is getting some good shots or creating open looks for some of his teammates?
Yeah, and I thought the Sixers, especially the first half, did a pretty solid job of getting Hero on some switches, whether it was Harden or Tobias. Both of them had some success against Hero. Really, with Maxey, like, I think he was 1 of 6 from 3 and 6 of 15 overall. Like, he was 5 of 9 inside the arc. Like, that's against that Heat defense. That's good. Like, he'll take 56% on twos. That's excellent. So it's just about not, like, it being a little more discretionary in the threes that he takes. Like we said, right? Some of the possessions where a 3 ended from him, you can still take a 3 in that possession, but just not when it came from him, right? So, like, if he goes 2 of 6 from 3 or 3 of 6, both, one's above his number and 2 in the second's much below, like, you're looking at a 22, 25 point game. And then we're sitting here going, yeah, they lost, but like, it was mostly about Harden and the DJ minutes and the backup center issue. Like, it's just about being a little more discretionary on a few possessions. I think he was generally pretty good. Like, I think he was solid. It's just about being a little more responsible with some possessions. And I think that's something that's really important for guys, in the playoffs, especially when you look at a team like the Timberwolves, who in that fourth quarter, game 6, D'Angelo Russell, Karl Anthony Towns, Anthony Edwards, not responsible with some possessions. They're all guys who aren't necessarily very familiar with, that sort of context in the playoffs. So just similar with Maxey. I know he's much younger than them, but just same idea, being one of the guys in the playoff context is something to learn from. So it's just it's not a huge change. It's just a little bit of a tweak from him. Whereas with Harden, he has to, I thought Harden, even in the first quarter, he wasn't great, but you felt him in that sense. In the second quarter, he was very good, and that was why the Sixers went, big reason the Sixers went into the halftime with the lead. Third quarter, a couple of plays to start, and then the Heat went on the run, and you look around, you're like, where did James go? I see him on the court, but I don't feel him. So if he keeps that approach from the first half throughout the entire game, they're in a good spot. But that felt like he was not there on as many possessions, where with Maxey, it was just a few possessions that he has to be better on. So it's not a huge change for Maxey, and I think he can get there, but it really does come down to James kind of being who he was in that first half. And I think first half, he had 12 points and 3 or 4 assists. Like, you get 24 and 8, 24 and 6 or 7 on 8 of 18 shooting, because he was 4 at halftime. Like, you'll take that. Like, that's a good game from James. And Maxey goes 7 of 15 or 8 of 15, and Tobias did going 11 of 16, goes 9 of 16, and Danny hits a couple more threes, and George hits 1 or 2. Like, I guess these are a lot of ifs, I know, but they're not huge changes. Like, I think those are all attainable outcomes for everyone on the team. And I'm even dialing back Tobias a little bit. So, and we saw that Tobias clearly has an advantage over a lot of the guys on Miami. So, as it comes down to offensively, and I think the defense was fine. They looked fatigued on some of those offensive rebounds. That one where I think they had 3 offensive rebounds that led to a 3, kind of was felt a little deflating for them. But like I said, I don't think game 2 is by any means out of the realm possibility. And Jimmy probably played better. But yeah, I think this team can certainly win. It just requires a little more shot making from some of the complementary guys and Harden and Maxey, be a little more consistent in, I would say Harden consistent and Maxey a little more careful with his possessions.
Well, we're looking forward to it. I mean, hopefully, like I said, to me, in my opinion, Sixers got to go for it here in game 2. Even if you get Joel back and everybody else is tired in game 3, that's a better scenario than being down 2-0. So, I mean, we're looking forward to it. Jackson, Paul, want to thank you guys for joining me and doing this. We'll keep doing this throughout the playoffs as long as the Sixers are around. Always fun having you guys on and talking hoops with you.
Happy to do it. Hopefully we get to do it next week. Hopefully it's not. I mean, I don't think it will be, but who knows? Game 4 is Sunday, so hopefully we get to talk on Tuesday.
Well, to take a page out of Doc's book, you know what? You guys might not like it, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyways. All right. So we'll wrap things up there. Before we do, don't forget, as I mentioned, always subscribe to the Liberty Ballers Podcast Network. Always appreciate a 5-star review if you're inclined to give us one. And of course, check out Paul, Jackson, and the rest of our talented writers at libertyballers.com. We'll have you covered throughout the rest of the Sixers postseason run.